I could feel my life force draining out as I sat propped up against the side of my boat. My leg was a mangled mess and I was bleeding heavily despite the fact that I'd tied a tourniquet. I didn't know how much longer I was going to live, but I was not going to go down without a fight. The monster great white shark was still cruising around my boat, silently but determined to finish its lunch. I had never worried about sharks in the past, but I did have a healthy respect for them growing up. Growing up on the coastline of Western Australia, I had spent a great deal of time fishing up and down the coastline. Every summer, my weekends would be full of fishing and camping as it was a major West Australian pastime. I had a half cabin cruiser. It was an 18-foot boat, which meant I could fish out in the deeper waters off the Perth coastline. My mate, Tony, rest in peace, always came out with me as he loved to go spearfishing. Neither of us imagined this would be our last trip together. If I survive this day, I will never forget the look of terror on his face as he tried to fight off the massive shark. Watching it shake him around like a rag doll reminded me of how a cat plays with its victim for a while, before it goes in for the death blow. I will be haunted forever by Tony's eyes if I make it out alive. And then out of nowhere, the massive shark lunged up and bit onto my outboard motor, shaking it from side to side as it raged. I hung onto the stool post to stop myself slipping towards the enraged shark. As quickly as it came, it disappeared back under the water. I could see the teeth marks on the engine, and I knew it would be pointless trying to start the engine as it would just attract the shark again. I had set off my ocean GPS safety locator and I'd radioed for help. I just hoped the emergency service would get to me before I bled out, or even worse, the shark finishes the job. You might be wondering how I got to this point. Well, we thought we'd picked a really good spot for fishing. It was not far from Karnak Island. The area had a seal population and was known as a great white shark habitat. However, we were not concerned as Tony was an experienced spear fisherman and I didn't usually go into the ocean. It was a picture-perfect summer day. The ocean was calm, no breeze, and the fish were biting. Tony was after a crayfish, so he suited up, dropped down into the water, and threw out a line intending on catching some deep water bream. I watched from the spot where Tony had gone down when all of a sudden I caught sight of a dark mass under the water. I leaned forward over the edge of the boat and saw a massive great white shark coming towards me. The sheer size and bulk of the shark was terrifying to see as it glided under the boat. I suddenly felt a deep unease. The shark did a large circle around the boat. I looked across the mark where Tony had gone down and I hoped like hell he had enough oxygen in his tank to stay down deep until that monster shark had moved on. Time ticked on, minutes seemed like hours, and this bloody shark stayed in proximity of the boat. I estimated at most Tony would have about 10 minutes of oxygen left. I knew Tony would be forced to come up, and I was grateful that he had a spear gun with him. The shark moved off into the depth and I lost sight of it. Tony was surfacing and I paced back and forth on the boat, waiting for him to break the water's surface so I could motion to him to get out of the water. As soon as his head popped up, I yelled at him, "Get out of the water!" Tony started swimming back towards the boat while I shouted, "Hurry up! Hurry up!" Wham! Something hit him on the opposite side of the boat and I fell forward into the ocean. The impact had sent me flying and I went underneath the boat. I desperately pushed my way back up to the surface and I swam around to where the engine was. As I climbed up onto the boat, I felt a tremendous surge of water come up over me and the jaws of the shark as it tried to get a hold of my legs, and I frantically kicked at it. My leg slipped into its jaw and I felt the unbearable pain as it clamped down onto my leg. I kept pulling away and suddenly I was free and I scrambled up onto the boat. I looked across and Tony had hit the shark with the spear gun. The shark swung around and went straight at him, hitting him directly in the chest. It was enraged and got a hold of Tony's body, shaking him savagely back and forth in its jaws, trying to rip his flesh apart. I heard Tony's gurgled cries as he flailed around like a broken rag doll. Mangled flesh and blood poured out of Tony's body. The beast dragged him under the water and I suddenly became aware of my own screaming. I collapsed down onto the floor of the boat, realizing that blood was pouring out of my leg. It was a mangled mess, and if I didn't stop the bleeding, I probably only had a matter of minutes to live. I got to my first aid kit and grabbed a towel to stem the bleeding. I set off my GPS and I went to call the Coast Guard when wham! The boat rocked violently again. The shark was attacking my boat and I feared it was going to sink it before the help came. The radio sprung to life and it was the Coast Guard. I told them what happened and now I had to wait for them to arrive and rescue me. My skin felt clammy, waves of nausea kept coming over me and it was getting harder to breathe. The shark was bumping and hitting the boat around like it was a bath toy. I can only assume it was hoping to tip me out. Tony had been its main meal, but it still wanted to eat me for dessert. The shark hit the side of the boat again, driving it sideways, and I heard the fiberglass crack. Water started to leak in as the boat lifted onto one side. Using the last of my strength, I pulled myself up onto the fishing chair. The Coast Guard boat pulled up alongside mine, and two guys jumped in to grab me. As they lifted me up, the shark lurched once again onto the engine and got a hold of it, shaking the boat in its jaws. The three of us went flying and I fell down against the side of the boat, hitting my shoulder hard. I yelled out in pain as I watched the shark continue its rampage on my boat. A large boom pierced the air, which drew my eyes towards the sound. A second boom went off and I realized it was the Coast Guard shooting at the shark. It let go of the engine and sunk down into the water. The Coast Guard got me on board their boat and we headed back to shore where a helicopter was waiting to pick me up. I was numb with shock and I felt more dead than alive from blood loss. I was rushed into a theatre and I woke up the next day to find myself in a hospital bed. I have replayed that day over and over, trying to figure out what I could have done differently. I have survivor's guilt because Tony saved my life that day and lost his own. I don't know if that shark lived or died that day, but I'll tell you the truth. I will never go out in that water in a small boat again. There are massive sharks in that water and they are hungry and aggressive. And I don't ever want to be in that shark's jaws again.